I have a few questions that I've taken from looking at some of your writing, but maybe we can first talk about your personal experience in the media industry. Maybe you could walk us through how did you get started in media in '86 with Channel 13, and were you coming from print at that time?
Well, I've always been a full-time faculty member in the University of the Philippines, teaching sociology and directing the Third World Studies Research Center. My experience in media prior to 1986 had been basically as a contributor to print magazines and occasionally doing some commentary for broadsheet newspapers. But something happened, as you may know, in February 1986. The Marcos dictatorship, which had been in power for almost 14 years, imploded basically through a combination of civilian people power and military mutiny. So in the so-called 4 days in February 1986, the Marcos regime eventually collapsed, with the Marcoses fleeing the country hastily, flying on American-supplied aircraft, first to Guam and then to Hawaii, where they lived in exile for a long time, and where Marcos eventually died. The Cory government that came to power immediately after the EDSA People Power uprising, or revolution, as some people prefer to call it, rode on the crest of a restoration of democracy movement, which had been percolating in Philippine society through, I would say, most intensively during the last 2 or 3 years of the Marcos dictatorship. So democratization was in the air, and that meant not just the restoration of democratic political institutions and the liberal media, but also essentially the inauguration of a more inclusive type of regime, which promised the inclusion of the vast masses of Filipinos in the national discourse as participants in the project of democratic restoration, rather than just a return to the status quo ante, was often derisively called elite democracy. So we thought that that was a very, very important juncture in the nation's history. And a number of people suggested that the type of symposia, forums, and lectures that we had been undertaking on the university campus, taking advantage of the relative autonomy of the University of the Philippines as a sanctuary for liberal thought, even during the period of martial law, might be extended to the more national audience. Instead of just academics and students talking to themselves. So I was invited to conceptualize public affairs program together with some professors and progressive film directors, in particular the late Marilu Diaz-Abay, who had been a filmmaker and for a long time had been contemplating a film about martial law, the national experience about martial law, immediately after the collapse of the Marcos regime. But, it was a period of transition, and it was very difficult to get, there was frenzy, there was excitement, and a lot of things needed to be done. And she and I thought that a public affairs program with a live audience on studio might be a more suitable venue for a more inclusive democratic discourse. So the title of the program that we put together was called Truth Forum. It was a takeoff from a series of community-based fora led by then ex-political prisoner Senator Jose W. Diokno, human rights lawyer, a crusader, one of the leading figures in the anti-Marcos movement, and imprisoned by Marcos. Senator Diokno was instrumental in bringing the voice of dissent to far-flung communities, and I was part of the movement that accompanied him during these sorties, which were labeled Truth Fora. So we thought that it was good to continue that tradition into the new administration as an attempt to democratize information and to include popular participation in the national debate.
Can you describe a little bit more about the
program itself?
Yes, the community fora that were being organized before the program was created.
Yes. Initially, these were fora that were hosted by gated communities of the upper middle classes of Philippine society. You know, as gated communities, they could function as relatively safe sanctuaries against any intrusion by the military and the police, which were under the control of Marcos. But this is particularly after the assassination of Ninoy Aquino in 1983. So that period from 1983 to the collapse in February 1986, Aquino was assassinated upon his return from the United States on August 21st, 1983. The brutal way in which he was killed at the airport and the funeral, which extended to more than 15 kilometers, was the first massive expression of rejection of the Marcos regime. That people, in the guise of a funeral, that moment, I think, unleashed a need, particularly on the part of the middle classes, for more information, to explore ways of articulating their opposition to the regime, which was in its death throes during those last three years, and manifested also by the economic crisis that had followed the assassination of Aquino. So they opened their villages. They're not really villages in the rural sense of the word. These are exclusive residential communities in the Metro Manila area. You could not easily gain access to them. But the organization of the middle classes against the regime began in such gated communities, first in the living rooms of the homes, and then inviting their neighbors with speakers like Senator Diokno, people from academia like myself, basically talking about the experiences of democratic struggles in other societies during that particular period, and the creative ways in which dictatorships were toppled and fought. The church was also instrumental in bringing together such communities, because sometimes the fora were held within the vicinity of the parishes in these gated communities. And there were a lot of activists at that time who were familiar with the Latin American experience. They spoke of the struggles of Latin America, in particular of the Sandinista struggle in Nicaragua. That was, at least for us in the Third World Studies Center, it was a basic inspiration and pointed the way for us what to do, where to go. We knew that the Marcos regime was on its way to collapsing. But what was important for us to consider was, what do you do in the aftermath of the collapse of a dictatorship? How do you put together a society again with functioning institutions? We didn't want a return to the oligarchical rule previous to martial law, not just an elite restoration. We wanted the full democratization of Philippine society. And we thought that an exposure to social democrats like Senator Diokno might enrich and lift the awareness of many Filipinos to other possibilities of reorganizing Philippine society. And this was the reason, actually, for those community fora. They were both anti-Marcos as well as fora in search of alternatives. What do you do after Marcos? Was a fundamental question being raised in these community discussions. And the label that those adopted for such fora, which were led by Senator Diokno, was precisely Truth Forum. Thought that the truth as a concept would be a powerful antidote to to fascism, to dictatorship, to the regime of lies perpetrated by strongmen. They caught on. Eventually, we were brought to the provinces, to schools. These fora, again using the phrase "Truth Forum."
This reminds me of a book published by Nicanor Changson, The Politics of Culture, in 1984, where he, I guess, the concerned artists of the Philippines were involved, and they organized a public fora called Makaisa 1. So Broca's there, Pete Lacaba's there, and probably others that. So one of the topics and the focus is also very similar to what you're saying. There's a discussion about truth in opposition to the regime. Would you say that what you're doing is similar to what, like, the concerned artists of the Philippines is doing?
Basically, the concerned artists of the Philippines and other theater groups, because they were really the spear point of organizing against Marcos. It was instant street theater. I would say they preceded the serious, more intellectual discussions. These were raw, they were very powerful, and they could be mounted in any street corner, in slum communities, and so on and so forth. The concerned artists of the Philippines, on the other hand, were reaching out to basically the student activist population, and there's a lot of cultural movements arose in the context of the dictatorship. It's always the case where what you cannot express and articulate in terms of outright political ideas, you could do in the form of theater. And essentially, it's almost like a tradition in Philippine society, because this was also how the anti-Japanese opposition during the Japanese occupation flourished through theater. Very, very subtle, sometimes outrightly subversive, but always making fun of the rulers and expressing truth in ways that, in very imaginative ways, that it's almost like a private joke between the performers and shared by the performers and the audience, but no outrightly subversive statements being made. To me, that kind of opposition went straight into the emotions, prepares a population for the more synthetic and more intellectual type of the role of people like myself, the academics, would then be to harvest such emotions and sentiments that had been created beforehand and formulate those into more coherent themes and hopefully a more coherent program of action, both in opposition to an existing regime, as well as an invitation to those who had been mobilized to actively participate in the conceptualization and definition. I think that's where ideas and academics like myself would come in, but the basic emotions should have been stirred up before that, should have been planted before that. Well, that we thought was the very, very important role played by the artists community during that time. And that includes some of the films that had been done by people like Broca and Cervantes, scripts written by Pete Lacaba and Ricky Lee, even very, very psychological films done by people like Ismael Bernal and Marilu Abaya. They were very, very sophisticated, very raw, very powerful, and reached into the psyche of an oppressed people. And the truth forums that I was describing to you basically were just attempts to put the pieces together and prepare communities that were already up in struggle against the regime for continued participation in what would come after. Because to me, I mean, looking back, I couldn't imagine how fragile dictatorships were. They seem at first glance to be completely powerful and everywhere and untouchable even. And then in 4 days, they're gone. So the more important question to us was, what do you do when that happens? How do you put a country together again so that the old formulas will not have much of a place? For old formulas would be supplied by the old elites who would tend to pick up the pieces and perform the political initiatives because they have the models that they've been accustomed to and call upon the same obedience that they had been accustomed to summoning in periods of crisis and uncertainty. But we wanted a different kind of society after Marcos. And I thought, people like myself thought that this was basically both a cultural as well as an intellectual, an ideological struggle that needed to be thought through very carefully. It was an opportunity that should not be wasted. Because I must tell you that Marcos, to the present strongman we have, was a far more sophisticated strongman in that he knew the role of intellectuals in putting together a regime and sustaining a regime over a long period of time. That's why he recruited a large number of cultural workers, artists, poets, writers, ideologues, speech writers, people from the film and literary circles. You can't imagine what kind of people Marcos brought into his circle. People who he had released from prison and subsequently used for his own purposes. I know that personally because a few months after the collapse of the Marcos regime, I was put in charge by the new government of a center that had been basically the home of the artists who had been integrated into the Marcos regime, used by the Marcos regime.
What was the name of the center?
The name of the center was President Center for Special Studies. That was originally the name, PCSS. This was carved out of a college from the University of the Philippines and subsequently brought out. This was the think tank of Marcos, a stable of speech writers, cultural researchers, poets, and so on and so forth. So some of them were writing scripts, actually, for, I told you, very rich programs, very impressive programs mounted on Channel 4, the government station. After the collapse of the regime, I was there and I saw the list of names of people who had been working. I had suspected that many of our colleagues, also from academia, a number of professors had been involved in the regime. Many of them acknowledged this and they said they had no choice. It was either imprisonment or you work as a cultural worker for the dictatorship. I'm not convinced by such an argument, but of course, I mean, who am I? I mean, it's a very complex situation. This is seldom touched upon in any history of the dictatorship, even during the period of Hitler in Germany. I mean, the way intellectuals were co-opted by Nazism. I guess it happens in every strongman regime. But not much is written about these things. I was aghast looking at the payroll and what these people were asked to do. I had written an essay about that and published.
What's the name of the essay?
The role of intellectuals it was a lecture I delivered in Sweden sometime in the late 1980s. The role of intellectuals in a dictatorship.
Yeah, I'd love to have a look at that if possible.
I don't think you can get a copy of that. It's unpublished. Very touchy subject because many of them are my colleagues in academia now. They knew what they were doing, and I guess some of them found a way of rationalizing their involvement with the dictator. Some of them could even say actually that they were on a mission for the left. So they probably imagined themselves as doing a double agent kind of role. It's not very convincing for me, but I mean, it was, to me, it was the most shocking thing. I had known about it, but when I was asked by the new government to take over that institute in the name of the new government, the documents had been basically sanitized and cleaned up. Because it took us 2 months. It took 2 months before the new government of Mrs. Aquino would know the existence, would be aware of the existence of many small offices under the president's office. This was one of them.
So the entire scope of the project had been somewhat.
I couldn't find any existing documents anymore, except those of the Commission on Audit. This was a government office. In every agency, you have a small office that takes care of payrolls, of expenses, and so on and so forth. That was not directly under the control of whoever is the director of that agency. I think they forgot that other departments of the government were collecting information with regard to payrolls and expenses and the budget and so on and so forth. So they were able to retrieve some material for that. But that's another story.
Well, let's. So what you're imagining with the Truth Forum is something very different. It's bringing these sort of salon type discussions into the larger public sphere using television as a medium. Do you feel like that was successful? Does that describe more or less how you sort of conceptualized the?
All right, it's a very important question because remember, I didn't have an experience on television before that. My experience with moderating forums and trafficking discussion was in academia, in the context of an academic setting. So I was assured by my director that it's not different. I mean, don't mind the audience outside. Just talk to the camera as if it was one of your students or.
This is very Ludia's Sabaya.
Yes, and that really allayed many of my anxieties about television. I could look straight into the camera as if it was just another person who's talking to that person, and that person is resting in his or her living room. So the camera was just another participant in a live audience. That was very assuring for me. I mean, it's as a technique. But to your question, remember, the title was Truth Forum. Most of our discussions were undertaken in English in those gated communities. It's the middle class. It's the English-speaking middle class. We switched to Filipino only if you go to the slum, maybe to a parish setting where you have a diverse audience. So the language that I was accustomed to in academia was always English. I mean, I talked to my students in English. So the questions that I had prepared, the discussion format was in English. But it so happened that my first guest, the main guest, and then I had a public forum consisting of people from the different sectors, maybe one from the unions, one from the slums, or several from the slums. I would have a student, I would have maybe a church worker, I would have a political activist, I would have a professor, a businessman. In other words, an attempt to somehow represent the diverse, multi-sectoral character of the Philippine society. That was the whole idea. It was an attempt to recreate the composition, the social composition of Philippine society on the stage. Sometimes I would have as many as maybe a dozen or 15 people from different sectors. And then I would have one or two main guests with whom I carry out a discussion, and then I throw the discussion to the audience on stage. And then we also took in, because this was a live show, questions from callers. Unfortunately, I mean, it was still the telephone. It would have been easier if we had social media and it's live streaming. But the format was very successful. For the first time, people felt involved. But the first episode taught me one fundamental lesson I could never forget, and it changed the entire structure and format of the show. My guest happened to be the head of the New People's Army that had been battling the regime for a long time, was imprisoned by the regime and released by Cory Aquino, the Communist New People's Army. This was Commander Dante, or Bernabe Buscaino. He happens to be from Tarlac, the Kapampangan-speaking section of Tarlac. I had known him before because I'm also from Pampanga. So we speak the same ethnic language, Kapampangan. We're not native Tagalogs, or which is the basis of Filipino. And he was not adept in English. He was a high school graduate, could understand English, but he would prefer to speak either in Kapampangan, which is our ethnic language, or in Filipino, in Tagalog, which is the language of the movement. So I was asking him questions in English. He would always reply in Filipino. And then during the station break for commercials, whispered to me, he said, "Randy," he said, "why do you have to speak in English? Whom are we addressing? Who is our audience?" He said, "I thought that the audience would be the Filipino people. They would not understand." I said, "They would understand English English. Okay, assuming that they would understand English, he said, I'm not very good at expressing my thoughts in English, as you know. Why don't we just speak in Kapampangan? So then 90% of our audience wouldn't understand us. I said, then let's speak Filipino. I said, I could speak Filipino, but that means having to translate my English thoughts into Filipino. He said, you have to try. So I struggled through the night, trying to translate simultaneously on camera the questions that I had prepared beforehand in English, the whole context of my questions, which are all in English, the way I had formulated my ideas in English into Filipino, and struggled through that. I thought that it was, eventually I was told it was what made the entire evening very, very instructive for people. It was the highest rating program in all my years as a television person. That first episode was so refreshing in its honesty, no pretense. People liked it, but it taught me one lesson: never to use English on television if you're addressing the public. Filipino public, because they might understand you, but they would not be able to identify with you. So, Truth Forum became the first public affairs television program whose medium was Filipino. An attempt to use Filipino as a medium of serious discourse, which would include the rest of the country. It was one of the highest rating public affairs programs. And eventually, all the other talk shows that had been previously in English had to convert a few months later into Filipino. Eventually, the early evening news had to be done in Filipino. Only the late evening news remained in English.
So this was quite groundbreaking.
It was groundbreaking. It's a watershed. It was a watershed, I think, in the history of Filipino media. And I was very happy that I was in the middle of that process. I'm not saying that our program was basically responsible for that shift, but I thought that we were the handmaiden of that shift. It would have happened anyway, eventually, because the protest was already being carried out in the language of the people, of the majority, which is Filipino. And Filipino had become the lingua franca, notwithstanding the fact that the regional languages had remained very popular. Interestingly, there was hardly any broadsheet. There was one broadsheet in Filipino. It remained only for 4 or 5 years. I wrote a column for that broadsheet. It was called Diario Filipino. It was, they took over I think the printing press of crony-owned newspaper, the Daily Express, under Marcos. But interestingly, the broadsheet, the main broadsheets then, in 1980s, remained in English and had remained basically untouched by Filipino. So that today you don't have a broadsheet in Filipino. That was the condition on television for a long time. So I knew, because Filipino was used in entertainment, definitely.
And in cinema.
In cinema too.
So what your description of the composition of the audience being multisectoral reminds me of a quote from Joseph Estrada. And you write about him a little bit in your book on sociology. I remember reading an interview, I think CNN interviews him, and he talks about how he would represent different sectors of society. Fishermen, labor organizers, jeepney drivers. And this is what gave him, he feels, a leg up on politics, so to speak.
That's right.
What's your take on, in a way it's similar, but of course it's not, a serious public discussion that he's engaged in the same way you are?
Well, Joseph Estrada made a name for it. First of all, his background is not working class. He is middle class to upper middle class. He went to Ateneo, the Jesuit school, for grade school and high school. He speaks good English, actually, but became known as a speaker of Carabao English, because that's the character he portrayed in the movies. And that endeared him to his public, playing the role of the jeepney driver, the taxi driver, the worker on the waterfront, the defender of the oppressed, basically, but who also came from their class and understood their language and their habits. But actually, his origins were none of that class. But that's the public image he cultivated. And he rode on that image. And people just loved him for the way he ridiculed the English speakers and the high and mighty of our society. In a sense, he was able to, as the strong man we have today, tap into a hidden resentment that people have had in a very highly unequal and unjust and oppressive society like ours. And that is also true for his longtime friend and departed colleague Fernando Poe Jr., who almost became president of the Republic had he not been cheated in 2004. That's FPJ. And that also accounts basically for the popularity of the FPJ, the Fernando Poe Jr. charisma in the person of his daughter, who's now senator of the Republic. And the charisma of Joseph Estrada was also somehow passed on. The name, the magic of the name, to his two sons, who are both running for senator today. And also to his wife, who used his name and became senator of the Republic. And of course, by Joseph Estrada himself, who in the first election in 1987, remember, 1 year after the collapse of the dictatorship, when the Cory magic and popularity was really unparalleled, she supported a slate of 24 senatorial candidates. Only one non-Cory candidate, I would say two, Joseph Estrada and Juan Ponce Enrile, who had been a so-called EDSA hero because he turned against Marcos. And Joseph Estrada, who had been actually a supporter of Marcos when he was mayor, survived the Cory magic onslaught. So eventually, 22 Cory candidates won and 2 non-Cory candidates. One of them was Joseph Estrada. The magic continues. And I would say that the Duterte phenomenon that we have today is nothing but a reprise of that mass populist appeal of a figure that people could identify with, but with a plus factor. The plus factor being that of a strong man, willful disciplinarian, who cracked jokes the same way, who unadorned, unpretentious in language, without any pretense to being an intellectual, but in a sense spitting upon the political correctness of a hypocritical society like ours. That has been the formula of characters that managed to break the political grip of the oligarchy in this country.
And I got interested in Estrada via an essay by Patricio Abanales on the national question, and how Estrada he's one of the, I think they're called the Magnificent 12, who vote out the U.S. bases.
Yeah.
In a way that sort of steals the fire from the left. In a way, I guess that's Abanales' point, that he kind of swoops in and takes up the mantle of anti-imperialism, as it were, during this vote against the U.S. bases. And the left plays a very marginal role in that, actually.
Well, I wouldn't say that it takes over the mantle of the nationalist banner entirely. I mean, I would say that I know this personally because Estrada had been a guest on my show. He was a senator, lost, I think, in that august chamber. And we guested him, and he was talking a lot of sense. It was an attempt somehow to balance his image as a movie actor who should not be taken seriously. I mean, for better or for worse, this is a person that many Filipinos identify with. So wouldn't we be interested to know where he stands on basic issues of political importance to us as a nation? For example, the national debt, the U.S. bases in the Philippines, what were his dreams for our country, the educational system, the language, and so on and so forth. And these were the themes that we touched upon when I guested him one-on-one on my show. And people were very impressed by that. And so he turned to many of us in academia for advice on a lot of questions, including the U.S. bases. He keeps boasting that his classic speech on the U.S. bases, in which he pronounced his position once and for all on the U.S. bases question, was ghostwritten by me. Well, I wrote that in Filipino. Mm-hmm. For him. And he said that it was the most important speech that he had ever delivered. And I'm very happy. In fact, many of our politicians thought that Estrada had been co-opted by the left. On the contrary, as a weapon. But they put little value on the intelligence of Estrada. He understood the issues. I don't think that we co-opted him or that we implanted something into his consciousness that he was not fully aware of. He understood. But I would say that this is not tantamount to a marginalization of the left. I would say it would be a fusion of, by left here, of course, I do not mean just the armed left, but the political left in this country, which is more extensive and more diversified, and not just the armed left. No, in that sense, I nuanced the formulation of Giorgio Abinales. The NDF left that had opposed, actually, participation on EDSA, believing that Cory was an American candidate, and that the EDSA process itself was nothing but a tactic that had been imposed or suggested to the elite in this country by American imperialism. Far too simplistic, I think. It's an attempt to reduce a very, very complex phenomenon that had elements of spontaneity. I think while the Americans did play a significant role, I don't think that they controlled the process of the transition. In fact, Cory went all out for the retention of the U.S. bases, but could not have her way with the Senate that she had helped elect. And I don't think that was just entirely the achievement of a few people, of select individuals like Estrada or Jokno or Tañada or any of the nationalist politicians. It was also, I would say, I mean, in all fairness, the long tradition of anti-imperialist struggle exemplified by the Philippine left, both the armed left, the underground left, as well as the left that was active, had always been active in academia and in the working class organizations.
One of the films, this is a little bit more peripheral to the films I'm looking at, but Sakuko ng Agila, Estrada is a very popular film about the bases. It includes, I noticed there's a BSIG flag in one shot and maybe a KMU flag in another shot at two different rally scenes.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's very aware of the politics and...
Oh, yeah. I was chairman of BSIG at one point. The founding chair was Lomenzo, whom you interviewed. We were comrades. BSIG was a socialist group, but it's not part of the underground left. As a matter of fact, the whole idea behind BSIG was to make a presence for the left that was not underground, but above ground, seizing whatever opportunities there were for organizing among the sectors, among the urban poor, the students, the professionals, apart from the working class, trade unions, students, the youth, and so on and so forth. I don't think that we were ever as big as the above ground organizations of the armed left. There was some rivalry, of course. I mean, in the way we formulated our ideological positions on key issues. I like to think it was a friendly rivalry. As in all other societies, the more organized, the bigger left would want to monopolize the political environment and to be the beacon of anything radical. I think we provided an alternative form of radicalism, BSIG. And so the banners and the flags appeared together in the popular consciousness and landed in films like you were referring to.
But is there some crossover between your work on Public Forum and your political work for BSIG? Are you thinking about politics in the same way when you move between these two spheres?
Interesting question. My experience as a television host is that, of course, you cannot totally separate your personalities. But as a sociologist, I am fully aware of the need to differentiate those roles. I cannot impose my politics. People would not listen to you. I espouse socialist positions, but I dare not impose them because I'm not the star of the show. I am supposed to moderate the discussion. And my function there is to bring out the positions of people and to tell the public that on any question, there are different positions that are available. Of course, I do an editorial at the end, so I have the last say on these issues. Now, if I can persuade a lot of people to my position, it's well and good. But there is no attempt on my part to organize using television. It's an attempt, what in Latin America is called the conscientization effort, a kind of pedagogy of the oppressed on television by bringing out the voices of the marginalized as on an equal footing, if not on even a superior footing. Because sometimes I would get technocrats on my show and they would be interrogated by the masses. So you have to explain your new tax program to the masses who are most affected by it. I mean, and in many instances, if a technocrat cannot communicate his complex thoughts in a language that the people could understand, his hesitation, his stammering, his inarticulateness would be a giveaway about maybe the lack of sympathy for that position. Whereas the people, if you hand over to them their own language, I mean, language is immediately empowering. They are very articulate. Suddenly their confidence is alive and they have no qualms asserting themselves in the discursive field that is television. They forget that there's a camera there when they don't feel obliged to speak in English. All awkwardness vanishes. That, I thought, was how empowering language is. If there is any medium that could, I think, break that divide, that wall between the elite and the masses, was language. If the elite could not adjust immediately to a situation like that, then the losers. So they have to speak the language of the people, as they must do in the political campaigns. See, of all political campaigns in this country, except those undertaken on media, are in Filipino. When you speak before a crowd, you have to do it in Filipino. When you talk about religion, you have to do it in Filipino or the ethnic language, seldom in English, except if you're celebrating Mass in a gated community. So they would tell you beforehand which are the English Masses and which are the Filipino Masses. The Filipino Masses are the best attended, actually. We had been aware of Paulo Freire's work. We had been aware of Ivan Illich, Gustavo Gutierrez, the entire school of disestablishment long before. There was an extensive permeation of Latin American ideas into this country, mainly because of the parallelisms in, for instance, the Christian Catholic tradition, the way in which the communities are organized in this country around the church, the Pueblo complex. That's why, the Philippines became almost a natural habitat for the theology of liberation, both as supplying the language and the vocabulary of struggle, as well as models for an alternative society, in particular the Sandinista struggle. During that. It was very inspiring for us. In fact, there was a book that had been written per sector of society, per institution of society, on what an alternative arrangement might look like for the economy, for example, for agriculture, for agrarian reform, for technology, the role of science, education, religion, and so on and so forth. In the Third World Studies Center, because it's where I spent most of my time, apart from being a professor of sociological theory, we were doing a lot of research in the Third World Studies Center on transnational corporations, the banana industry, sectors of Philippine agriculture that had been integrated into the circuits of global capitalism. We did work on McDonald's and Coca-Cola in the pursuit of the process we had called the McDonaldization of, it was very new as a concept at that time, McDonald's, but we used it to represent the idea of transnational chain stores that were taking over and transforming food culture in a country like ours, fast food chains. Before that, it had just been Coca-Colanization, but introduction of McDonald's had both good and bad effects. On one hand, it introduced a model of business of efficiency that was subsequently emulated by Jollibee, a Filipino company. But also, I think it's instrumental in flattening the rich food culture in this country and homogenizing it, and in a sense affecting the rural economies that fed the pre-existing food culture. And the marginalization of the Filipino farmer is also traceable to that.
This is kind of, the domain of, dependency theory?
Exactly, which is also Latin American in conception. Cardoso, Andre Gunder Frank, and so on and so forth. The Third World Studies Center was animated by dependency theory. I had met Andre Gunder Frank several times in the 1980s, and Samir Amin had a different version of dependency, and many others. And Third World Center, whom you might visit, I think, while you are in the university, is still around, became the hub of alternative thinking, which was not simply Maoist, but far richer than the tradition of the Chinese experience. We wanted to explore other forms of radicalism. Of course, sometimes we were ridiculed by the Maoist left, by the armed left, seen as a threat to their ideological supremacy of, at least, of the small circle of Philippine activism. But I thought that both the Third World Studies Center and Public Forum, because we subsequently, after a year, renamed it Public Forum, and the column that I had written in conjunction with that program, Public Lives, which appears in the Inquirer, from which I got many of the columns and articles that are compiled in Nation, Self, and Citizenship.
So my advisor Steve's having me. He had me read some Hutchcroft and some.
Oh yeah.
So he's their student.
Yeah, Paul Hutchcroft was one of those fellows who came. I know him personally. He was much younger than I. The contemporaries of Abinales, of Giorgio. Giorgio Abinales was our University Research Associate in the Third World Studies Center. We worked for a long time in Third World Studies. He was a constant guest also in public forum.
Do you think any of their political economy work, like McCoy's sociology work on families?
Anarchy of families.
Yeah. Do you think that at all contradicts the dependency thesis in terms of their, I guess, the restoration is kind of idea they have of the elites coming back after Edsa?
Well, you're referring to the book of McCoy and de Jesus.
In his earlier book, where he looks at the history of regional elites.
Yeah. Basically, I think they're looking at the sources of the Philippine economy, basically, the basic foundations, the roots of the Philippine economy, and the types of social classes that emerge as a result of the basic structure of that economy. That's why he was looking at the Iloilo sugar industry. But I don't think that there was any attempt on their part, McCoy, to explain the political economy of the country itself and its relationship to contemporary capitalism, to global capitalism. The nexus that they were looking at was the earlier form of mercantilism. And for instance, in the sugar industry, was the principal nexus with the American economy. Let's say, somebody who would probably bring that to a different level would be Jonathan Fast and Jim Richardson in their book Roots of Dependency. And I would probably read McCoy's and the works of the younger American scholars who came here subsequently, were attempt to explore the roots of dependency on the national level, both political and as well as economic. In a sense, I would say they were supplementing the framework of dependency theory itself, providing the substantive material, but they were not dependentistas, definitely. Somebody like Al McCoy, for example, whose work I'm very familiar with, in fact, using some of the concepts of patronage, which belongs to an earlier era of Philippine sociology, the patron-client type of relationship between the landlord, let us say, and his tenants. There is still an element of that, but it cannot fully explain the kind of society we have today, which is far more complex. But on the other hand, I'm just totally dissatisfied with the Maoist formulation of bureaucrat capitalism and feudalism. I have very little sympathy for such formulations because definitely Philippine society displays many quasi-feudal characteristics. But to call it semi-feudal, that means that you can have modes of production that are half-half. But in fact, the reality is that they're articulated into one another, the feudal and the capitalist aspects. That's the thesis we wanted to demonstrate. For example, in our work on the banana industry in the Third World Studies Center, our principal researcher was Giorgio Abinales, Mindanao. We wanted to show how modern contemporary capitalism, both on the Japanese side as well as the transnational corporations like Castle and Cook and Del Monte, could exist in combination with family-run farms, small growers of banana planters actually, using family labor. In other words, exploiting their own family members in the name of global capitalism. It's a phenomenon that has been manifested elsewhere in Africa, for example, as well as in Latin America. So global capitalism works with a variety of modes of production in different societies. And it's very difficult to generalize as dependency theory does. You just have to look into the complexity of every country's situation and demonstrate through case studies what's happening on the ground, because it gives you an idea of what forms of consciousness would then result from this, what kind of relationships would bind workers in such plantations to, because they don't see the capitalists that are running this. They see only their own kind dictating the pace of work and so on and so forth. It's very difficult to get an idea of that unless you live and do field work among them, which is what we attempted to do.
How about this bilateral kinship, I guess, thesis as applied to media? like family-owned media, the Lopez family's media, or I think you write about the Times. How does this articulate in the realm of media?
Well, in the first instance, I think that family-run corporations are almost a tradition in this country. I mean, the successful families, economically and financially, had been able to integrate themselves into the ethos of modern capitalism by hiring professional managers to work with them. In many instances, what you would find in these family-run corporations, like the Ayalas, for instance, the Ayala Group, the Henry C. Group, Aboitiz Group, the Lopez Group of companies, the Gokong Wei Group of companies, and so on and so on. These are all the George T., the Andrew Tan. What you would have there is family control of the boards of directors. A number of families or proxies of the family would sit in the board. So they control decision making at the corporate level. But the actual running of these corporations is left basically to professional managers. That's what you would notice now. In the case of ABS-CBN, that is indeed part of the Lopez Group of companies. They have so far managed, because they returned to media after 1986 when their properties were returned to them. And they were quite lucky that Eugenio Lopez Jr., who had spent many years in the United States, because he escaped from prison, from Marcos prison, and then came back, was a very, very good executive. They wasted no time in putting back together the Lopez media empire, which became, in fact, the spear point of the restoration of the rest of the Lopez companies. They were lucky. The son of Eugenio Lopez Jr., Gabi Lopez, went to Harvard for his MBA, so he knew the entrails of modern capitalism and how it was. Very modern in thinking. And so modern, he brought in executives that shared the same mentality. Same thing is true for the Lopez, the Ayala Group of companies, and the Gokong Wei. The defiance that took over their families can no longer be regarded as semi-feudal, semi-colonial. These are very, very modern companies. We call them family companies because they're still basically owned by, but they're traded in the stock market. My last stint on television was with ABS-CBN, so I'm quite familiar with how it works. And once in a while, I sit in the board of advisors of ABS-CBN. So I know also the management side of it, advising them on programs and so on and so forth, and navigating the complex political terrain. So your question is, how does it affect the operation of media?
I mean, I've read McCoy's essay on the Lopez family, and I guess maybe it seems to actually lack a little bit of nuance. As you say, it's a fully corporate modern operation. And the fact that it is also maybe, as Philippine society, more or less oriented towards family structure. What impact does that actually have? Is it, I guess, McCoy, Hutchcroft, and even people like Lisandro Claudio would say there's like a sort of restoration of the elite or whatever. But that seems a bit blunt, right? A little bit heavy-handed.
I think that needs not just nuance, but a full explication of the complexity of the situation that you have. It goes as well for the analysis of politics in this country. I mean, the family becomes a very important organizing principle in many areas of the economy, politics, even, I would say, academia. I have 4 children. 2 of my children are professors in the same university. But of course, they got those positions on their own merit because the university itself as an institution is not controlled by my family. But there are a number of universities that have been taken over by families. Ownership. The corporate structure has to be modern in order for them to survive. I mean, you cannot promote professors on the basis of their kinship. They know that only too well. I would say that the articulation and the dysfunctional impact of family and kinship relations would be more visible in the field of politics than in the economy. I think that in corporations like the Ayalas, the Lopezes, the Aboitiz, in fact, I would say almost all, with the probable exception of the PLDT group, the Manny Pangilinan group of companies, PLDT, Philippine Star, which is owned by them, Channel 5, which is owned by the Pangilinan First Pacific group of companies. You can't talk of a family there. What you can talk about there is money that had been consolidated under the control of Manny Pangilinan. The bulk of that money came from Hong Kong, the mother company, Hong Kong, owned by an Indonesian Chinese. That is why a lot of essays had been written precisely bringing up the idea that maybe some of these funds were taken out of Indonesia and invested in the Philippines. And I know why would Filipinos complain about that? But that's an exceptional type of company. Other company that you might say underwent the transformation from being a family-owned, not controlled by any clan, is San Miguel Corporation, which is under Ramon Ang today, who started as a kind of right-hand man of Eduardo Cojuangco, who originally was not part of the San Miguel. They just took over during the period of martial law. This was owned by the Sorianos, the old Spanish elite, related to the Ayalas. So, I mean, it's a far more complex thing. And in fact, it's one of the things that have been on my mind as a research theme, because I think the exploration of the history of these family corporations and their transformation during the period of the 1980s, 90s, and the 2000s, with globalization, compelling them to adopt much more modern, more globalized ways of doing business. In other words, a discipline of the market in order to survive, which means that you cannot promote, you cannot assign, make appointments on the basis of kinship, or prefer family businesses all the time, affiliated businesses. They have to play that with a certain degree of sophistication. I think that I would, because most of them are authorizing the writing of biographies of their elders. To me, it is untapped literature that should be explored, because they basically represent the history of the company. They make for very interesting reading.
I haven't been able to read Mina Rosas' full biography. I've read an essay, and it goes up to 89, I think, and then the Lopez or the McCoy essay, I think, goes up to the early 90s or whatever. But they talk about Sinaki's his relationship with Aquino, and I guess there is a political lever in place.
That's a more visible, and maybe from a journalistic point of view, more interesting. I mean, it tickles the imagination, but you cannot use that as an explanatory model for something far more complex. I mean, Sinakis was a very interesting character. He was a Greek technocrat, came to the Philippines as an engineer for Meralco, owned by the Lopezes. I mean, it makes for interesting reading. It reads like a novella. Married the only daughter of sugar magnate Eugenio Lopez, the founder of the company, whose brother Fernando Lopez was vice president to Marcos. See, I mean, Al McCoy is very fond and very successful, I would say, in teasing out those tidbits that bring out the personal dimension. But to exaggerate the importance of such elements, I think, would be to slight the structural aspects, which to me are more longer term, more interesting, and more solid, I think, in providing explanatory models. I think if you were writing the history, the biography of a family, it makes for interesting reading. But Al is a historian. And maybe if I were a historian, I would write the same way. I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in forces. I'm interested in structures. I'm interested in long-term movements of events, which require, I think, a different model of explanation. I'm interested in generative theories. How is this possible? What makes it possible over the long term?
Would there be any credence to, if you see family, the sort of bilateral kinship group manifesting more in politics than in capital structures and corporate organizations? Is there kind of like a base superstructure lag going on here? Is that something that you could argue?
No, that would be too mechanical, I think, a representation of it. I would say there is a dialectical interpenetration of kinship dynamics and the way business entity is run. There are some compelling necessities, I think, of a systemic nature in running a business that cannot be ignored, even by the most disciplined and tightly knit family. Just can't ignore them. So families need to make decisions, even against their own interests, in order to survive. They want to survive for the longer term. Of course, I mean, what complicates matters here is the way in which businesses... Lopez's, for example, their base had been the sugar industry, then went into sugar industry and then cement, power generation, Meralco, then media. They owned print, Manila Chronicle. They had broadcasting, both radio and television. But the new constitution prohibits ownership of Trimedia ownership. So you can own broadcast, just broadcast. You cannot own print at the same time. Ownership of media allows you some leverage in politics. But the way in which that leverage is employed is something that needs, I think, a more nuanced description. It doesn't follow that anybody who's chosen by the family would then be the beneficiary of media exposure.
Right.
And so on and so forth.
And it can be counterproductive in the essay that you wrote, Newspapers as a Public Trust.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the Cojuangco family. Is that pronouncing that correctly? They run a story on government corruption, but they just so happen to be the bidder that loses, and that discredits their newspaper actually.
That's not the Cojuangco family. It's Gokong Wei.
Yes. Okay.
That's the Manila Times.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's I know you mentioned that in your question. I know that because it caused some misunderstanding between me, for example, when I wrote that column and I appeared not to protest, to take over. The Manila Times, this is the oldest newspaper, had a succession of owners of different kinds outside of the Rosas family that had owned it for a long time. The old man, Chino Rosas, had been a stalwart of the opposition against Marcos. But he also played actually a very complex role vis-a-vis Marcos for a long time. The Manila Times was the hub of, not which defined Philippine reality for a long time, for the general public. It's the role of media. It tells you what the reality is like, the official. Then, but it fell into hard times. By the time EDSA took place, it was no longer the credible, influential newspaper that it had been for a long time. There were new players in the market, the Inquirer being one of them. Then the Star, run basically by cooperatives and families that had no previous experience in media, like the Prietos.
The Inquirer.
The Inquirer.
Jess Matubius told me that the Lopez family was funding the Inquirer initially. Is that not true?
No. So it's misinformed. The Lopez's had nothing to do with the Inquirer. I don't think they own a single share of stock in the Inquirer. One of the owners, individual owners, in fact, you would not guess, Juan Ponce Enrile, and then Manny Pangilinan. But the bulk of the shares were owned by the employees cooperative in conjunction with the Prieto Rufino family. I think the bulk of the shares were the Prieto Rufino. But the Inquirer, its origins is very interesting. It was set up by journalists and media workers who started it. They started it at the onset of the new government, actually, when they felt that the chronicle of the Lopez's had to give it up. Then it was sold subsequently. It wasn't sustained. The Lopez's concentrated on television and broadcast. Then there was a vacuum. So all kinds of newspapers came in. You have the Tribune, you have the Evening News, you have Manila Times tried to regain its previous dominance. The Chronicle disappeared from the scene. The Malaya, which was an anti-Marcos newspaper, continued but had to be sold. So the media situation in this country is very, very complicated. I wouldn't say it's in the hands of any single family, which, I mean, from the point of view of a person like me, is a good thing, because then you have that mix of diversity that makes for the discourse on truth and information more lively. And
do you think that you had your finger on a pulse with like Public Forum that some of the old broadsheets did not? They're all publishing in English, of course.
Yeah, definitely. I miss that program because I could easily reach at least maybe 5 to 10 million people in one evening. It was every Monday evening for a period of 1 hour. But eventually we were pushed to the midnight section, because as the economy flourished, there were more people that wanted the prime time and were willing to pay. for entertainment program. In a sense, therefore, there was a group of us who ran parallel public affairs programs on the same time slot, 10:30 in the evening. We called ourselves the 10:30 Club. We were friends, actually, in the different stations and competing for the same audience. Eventually, we found ourselves all being pushed to the 11 o'clock, then 11:30, then 12 midnight, until I said, no, this is pointless. Eventually, my last stint with ABS-CBN, I said, the advertisers, prime time now includes up to midnight, they said. So could you just move to cable? Cable, that's the English-speaking audience. Why would I want to talk to a minuscule constituency that have all the information at their fingertips? I want to reach the rest of our people. But unfortunately, to reach the rest of our Filipino people, you would need advertisers who are willing to. I mean, we don't have like National Public Radio, NPR, in the US, or let's say a program like 60 Minutes in the US that have a block of advertisers that are loyal to them because they see it as part of their civic duty to fund programs like this. When I was starting out, I used to think that we had such loyal. And I had friends in the business community. I mean, the Lopezes and the Zobels, people I know, and I can talk to them. But unfortunately, the owners do not always make decisions about where to put their advertising money, because that's handled by several layers of marketing agents. You cannot always expect a Zobel de Ayala or a Lopez to tell them, no, you give Randy the chunk of your advertising funds for this month. No, you can't order them, because the bottom line is profit. It's profitability, even if they're my personal friends.
Do you think also that the political moment, that the EDSA moment had sort of receded also, that there was a diminishment of the sort of public clamor for this type of interaction on television?
Interesting question. With a very, very complex answer. That's 1986. How many years ago was that? That's 42 years? Not 42. 1986, 32 years, right? It's a long time. It's more than one whole generation. There is a lot of information swirling around now. Even television recognizes that within the next 5 years, the digital will take over. The internet will take over. What had been hitherto a monopoly of broadcast. And you see it in the shift of advertising money, actually. It's going into YouTube and social media. People are producing their own shows and mounting it on. There's a lot of this. I welcome it. I think it's part of the empowerment that the internet has created, to empower every individual so that truth is no longer a monopoly. Information is no longer a monopoly of those who decide with what kind of reality to present to the public. So there's a lot of room for debate. And of course, there's a lot of room for fake news as well, and so-called alternative facts. But to me, it's part of the situation that is created. No? I mean, the point is that the transition that I was talking about is not only due to the waning of the memory of EDSA. Of course, you expect that to happen. But it's also attributable to the proliferation of alternative sources of information. And I would say that the principal losers here had been the newspapers, the broadsheets. Maybe I would be lucky to reach 100,000 readers through my weekly column, Public Lives. And maybe one radio commentator would read my column and discuss it. I would be thankful for that. Or maybe somebody posts a link to the digital version of my column into his or her Facebook account, and that person will have so many followers and hopefully would click that and read the entire column, have the patience. But if I had to rely on newspapers on the print version, it would be a waste of time. Most of our young people don't read newspapers anymore. In fact, they hardly listen to television.
Yeah.
They're focused on that small screen, their mobile phone or their tablets. And that's going to worsen, in my mind, in the next 5 or 10 years. That's why I find it very ironic and, in fact, almost absurd that our politicians in this country are hanging on to their power to issue franchises to operate a television station. And this is precisely the problem that ABS-CBN faces today, because they have incurred the ire and the enmity of Duterte, who has expressly told him that as long as I'm president, I'll make sure that you're not going to renew your franchise, which is up for renewal in 2020.
Right.
in 2 years' time. He's still president during that time. So I'm just looking at the situation. I said, in a sense, in many ways, who cares about franchises?
Right.
In a digital world, I mean, you can mount the same programs without you having to go through the usual traditional broadcast platforms.
Right. Rappler was doing initially as a sort of alternative news source.
They can never kill Rappler in that sense. I mean, Rappler will always find a platform. I mean, it's just so, it reflects the Jurassic thinking of the decision makers in this country who willed on to their power to issue franchises to think that they can control something as globalized and so advanced as modern social media platforms. It's, they have to wake up to a new reality. This is what I'm saying. I mean, people are reacting to a process that is irreversible. I mean, globalization, to me, is irreversible. You can react to that by adopting ideological, nationalistic platforms which represent certain atavistic models, actually. That will not stop globalization, but it taps into the insecurities of people who feel that their country, their societies are being invaded by outsiders, that somehow their national interests are being betrayed by their leaders, that they are not part and parcel of the process of development and prosperity that had been promised by traditional leaders, and so on and so forth. Duterte has been very successful in being able to tap that kind of resentment, no? But not for long, not for long.
This brings up like the point that you had made in one of your essays about the potential for establishing political parties in the Edson movement that then kind of seem to fade. To me, it seems you see a similar problem with the fraternal organizations like unions, which also sort of fade as a concept or a sort of organizational, socio-political concept. And they also fade out of the cinema, actually.
Yeah.
So you don't see these films like, from 1984 that I'm looking at. It may have been marginal anyway. What do you think about the fading of not only labor politics but themes in cinema and media that have these politics?
There are two separate questions, I mean, but they reflect one another. I would say if you're looking for a tradition of labor and working class activism in this country, its heyday might have been in the 1930s, 1940s, possibly 1950s. With the coming in of modern technology, and then labor organizers from the Jesuit community that had teeth cut the New York waterfront. Mm-hmm. I'm referring to the Institute of Social Order, run by the Jesuits. The American Jesuit community had sent very sophisticated labor organizers, which were not simply liberal, but social democratic in orientation. It was also meant to counter communist influence, because the backbone of the old Communist Party had really been the working class. In the printers, in media, actually, as well as in academia. The old Communist Party, the Soviet, until the Maoist Party took over in the 1960s, using actually the peasant orientation. In a sense, it was a good analysis, because the peasants outnumbered the working class, the small working class in this country. But it's very, very difficult to organize the peasantry. Even Marx did not ascribe much value in peasant organizing. He was thinking of the European situation, the mixed bag of potatoes, he said. Very difficult to organize the peasantry. Certainly not for a socialist revolution, kind of socialist revolution he had in mind. But the working class movement in this country was very sophisticated in the 1930s. So mature and so advanced as to serve as the backbone of an honest-to-goodness Communist Party. And also we had a Socialist Party in the Philippines. It was before the Communist Party of the Philippines, NPA. Interestingly, the nationalist movement, represented by Recto, Cañada, and all the prominent national politicians, were anti-American, had nothing to say about social justice issues, because many of them came from landed families. To the nationalists, and here Jojo Benales was correct, it's a view that we had always known in the Third World Studies, that our revered nationalist icons had nothing to say about land reform, nothing to say, very little to say about workers' issues, about labor organizing, and so on and so forth. The focus of the nationalist struggle was vis-a-vis the United States of America, the former colonial master, and took the concrete form of an anti-Bezos movement. It's not entirely a mistaken perspective, because the need by the United States for U.S. bases in the Philippines and the I mean, the entire country was basically an American base with several branches. The last remaining ones were Clark and Subic. These essential needs of the United States compelled every American administration to interfere in our elections and in our political system. It was basically a security issue. There was very little to exploit in the Philippine economy. It's an underdeveloped economy. As somebody said, maybe the main problem of a country like the Philippines is not that it was exploited, but that it was not exploited enough.
Right.
Because then there would have been intensification of capitalist development. No, it remained a basically agrarian economy for a long time, because the Americans could have forced land reform in this country the same way they did in Japan with the defeat of Japan, or in Korea. They did not do so in the Philippines because they decided to live with the elite, the landed elite in this country, who were securely in the pocket of the American administration, with the exception of a few maverick politicians like Recto.
Francisco Namenzo, I think he told me that Blas Ople was even writing speeches for Recto, or maybe I'm not right on that one.
Yeah, he was. He certainly was.
So there was sort of a second, and he said that Ople was on the periphery of the communist movement, not really
Yes, he was
inside
not.
of it.
He was not an insider. He wasn't a member of the party.
Did the politics permeate at all to the Rectoian sort of perspective, or not so much?
No, Recto had always been, he spoke very little English. He was a Hispanic aristocrat from Batangas. Many of his speeches were written by my father-in-law, Constantino. He was a young journalist, diplomat, Renato Constantino. He was a historian. He was a young intellectual who worked with Recto. He was a Marxist, though, unlike Recto, who was not. So he was aware of the social justice element. But in the national political realm, the social justice issues in this country that had persisted over a long period of time did not get proper legislative attention, even from those we regarded as our progressive nationalists. Their class affiliations were just too powerful to outweigh or overshadow. And it wasn't in their mental map. The mental map with which they were working was still, how do you complete the independence of this country from its erstwhile colonial master, the United States, who had taught us governance but had not been confident enough to hand completely the reins of self-governance to us. Interestingly, I think I remarked in one of my columns that all of us, my generation, was brought up on that nationalist tradition. And in many instances, it was a nationalist tradition. It was anti-communist and even anti-socialist.
This is Abinales' point, I think.
Well, Abinales was part of our circle. He was busy. He was part of the Third World Studies Center. And he had been part of the youth wing of the Maoist group and found it totally intellectually bankrupt and left.
Interests me, I guess, is how some of the ideas of national democracy permeate the media. Like,
oh yeah, even now.
So Chongson, right? He's
Yeah.
talking about the mass movement that's nationalist, and that I think there's an impact on people like Broca and De Leon,
Yeah,
and they make these labor films, right?
yeah.
So how does that work exactly?
Well, let's say they're not ideologues, all right? But they represent what they regard to be the advanced way of thinking. Broca, in particular, is a social critic. The young people he works with, who assist him in his films, people like Ricky Lee, right, with him, I think they collaborate. Ricky was part of the movement, Maoist.
And Macaba was as well.
He was. They were young people who gained their activist spurs within the context of the emergent Maoist movement in the 1960s, which was both an attempt to not just to overthrow Marcos or the establishment, but also to overthrow the Soviet-oriented old Communist Party of which Dodong Namenzo had been a part. And so was Jose Maria Sison, until he bolted out and created his own party. See, I mean, that's, you might say, the more orthodox type of Marxist communist movement, in contrast to the emerging, more popular, more populist, more successful in tapping youth activism of Maoism. And it wasn't just in the Philippines. I mean, the rise of Maoism, symbolized by the Red Star and the Maoist cap, was basically inspired by the 1960s Red Guard revolution in China. I can speak on a personal basis that I was a student in England at that time in the late 60s. And I thought I was free of that environment. But England, Manchester, which was the birthplace of Engels' analysis of the working class in England, and that was real Marxism, was being displaced by Maoist influence. I said, Maoism in Europe? It seems so absurd. But it's not so absurd. I mean, it's the romanticism of Red Guard, vanguardism.
It became a big part of the New Left in the United States.
Oh, indeed. And also Europe, including France. Jean-Paul Sartre was somehow co-opted by the French Maoist movement.
And I guess Althusser.
In many ways.
Bernard,
Nikos Poulantzas, Althusser. The only sophisticated one who was unscathed, I think, was Michel Foucault, who had always been an intellectual. He was a member of the French Communist Party and found it bankrupt intellectually, left. He was more adventurous, more imaginative, far richer in vocabulary. They didn't mind him because he was not an organizer. But I mean, the kind of influence that post-structuralism of Foucault in literary circles and media circles continues to this day.
I guess it's interesting that it's rather late in the game in the 80s that the sort of mass line is cropping up in cinema this way. Of course, the movement's very strong here.
Movement is very strong here, but I think it has reached its limits.
And it seems to me also, if you compare it to like the 30s to the 50s, it doesn't accurately reflect the strength of the labor movement. To see these films might be a simulation, as it were, of the strength of the labor movement.
In the 1930s and 40s, I mean, I wasn't alive during that time, but just reading what was available. The labor movement, you would see the influence of the labor movement and the themes of labor and exploitation and oppression of the working class. Not just in film, but even in zarzuelas. This is the local stage. I mean, Nick Johnson would know that. The local theater that was acted. There were socialist themes. Of course, the socialist movement was very strong in a place like Central Luzon. But this... And the heyday of labor organizing was really 1950s and 60s, which was also the heyday of the socialist movement here. The focus of communist organizing was the working class, the trade unions, which wasn't so under the CPP-NPA. But the split, the Sino-Soviet split, really emasculated the left-wing movement everywhere in the world. And eventually in a country like ours, where left-wing activism was championed no longer by the working class, but by the students, as in the United States. Marcuse notes this in his book, One-Dimensional Man. Of course, he ascribes it to the bourgeoisification of the proletariat in American society, that they became beneficiaries of the exploitation of the third world. But how do you explain the exploitation of the working class in the third world, and which wasn't being given articulation by the left? Rather, reliance was on the peasantry as constituting the base of the revolution. Of course, they still pay homage to the role of the working class. I think it has to do also with, as I was doing my doctoral dissertation on the waterfront, with changes in the organization of global capital itself. I was studying waterfront workers.
The Cabot system.
The Cabot system, which meant that as in New York, as in London, in Manchester, the strongest trade unions were dock workers. I was fascinated by how that was reflected here. I worked as a waterfront worker in the course of gathering data. And that's how I uncovered the Cabot system as a way of recruiting workers. But something changed towards the late 60s and early 70s. In the shipping industry, the introduction of container shipping meant that dock workers would no longer be necessary. That could be handled by machines. The loading of shipments was no longer taking place on the waterfront, but in far-flung warehouses, far away from the view and the supervision of the trade union bosses. And these were dispersed all over the country, in the US, in Europe, and so on and so on. And these were just trucked. You see them today. These huge containers brought to the waterfront, no longer handled by stevedores but by machines that automatically hook these containers, hoist them, and then drop them into the holds of the ship. What happens to your working class there?
And your political organization.
And your political organizations. And this occurs overnight. And the entire Cabot system was demolished because of that.
in the 60s?
This
or
was
earlier?
no. I would say this happened early 70s.
Early 70s. Okay.
Yeah, but by which time, of course, martial law was already declared here, and the military controlled the ports. Could not do anything. But this was happening worldwide. And when we were organizing BISIG and wanted BISIG to be anchored on the activism of the working class, I was very active in organizing hotel workers and bank workers, Nurain, etc. They were part of the BISIG complex, and they were our most active members, actually. And then students, workers, and so on and so forth. There's a doctoral thesis by Vince Boudreau that documents this. Vincent Boudreau is now the president of City College of New York. Unfortunately, I don't think he has published it. No?
Probably still get it there.
In fact, we were organizing shopping mall workers in coordination with the NFL, National Federation of Labor, of Bong Malonzo. You should talk to Bong Malonzo.
Bong Malonzo?
Ibarra Malonzo. Maybe Dong would know him. He's based in Mindanao. Can tell you about the entire labor movement. Can also talk to Danny Edralin. He was active in Nurain. At that time, when we were organizing, I would say that around 15% of the Filipino working class was organized. I thought that was so minuscule. We wanted to bring it up to create new unions in different industries. But instead of growing, dwindled even further. Maybe it's less than 10% now, the organized sector of the working class in this country. Killed by casualization, the end of contract legislation that permitted the hiring of temporary workers and bred the practice known as ENDO, the end of contract. After 5 months, you're dropped from the role, so you're not entitled to. Anytime that you enter a union, you're not renewed. So I think the biggest sectors of workers, since we have so many of them, are the malls. Every corner is a shopping mall. Must have struck you how many sales personnel there are in the malls. They're not organized. You can't organize in the malls.
So Mike De Leon, he later repudiates Sister Stella L on a Facebook post. He says it was his worst film. It was ideological. Do you feel that these films don't necessarily reflect the reality of the labor movement, actually?
They're aspirational, I think. They're aspirational, not the reality. You have a few icons like Sister. She was based on a real character, a nun who was ministering to the urban poor families who were connected to. She was not a labor organizer in that sense. Very sympathetic to people in pickets or strikes, as we were. We were professors and instructors participating in workers' pickets. I remember my first picket was SM Makati. It was the only SM at that time. And so here we were, I was an instructor with my wife, invading Makati with our students, forming the picket line, assisting. Suddenly the goons hired by the malls came with their stick, and then the police came and started arresting not the goons but us. This was already after the collapse of Marcos, under the new government, Cory. Fortunately, the mayor of Makati, who had been installed by Ms. Aquino, was a human rights lawyer, Binay, who ran for president. He was my contemporary in UP. And I was complaining to him. I said, you should restrain your police. I said, instead of truncheoning us. The student said, Randy, you're from Diliman, Quezon City. What were you doing in Makati? I said, the working class has no fatherland. I said, they're everywhere. So you should know that. I said, you're a human rights lawyer. I said, no, you go away. I will release you from detention. But I cannot stop the policemen from. SM is our biggest employer here, biggest taxpayer. So he forgot all his human rights because he was thinking of the big taxpayer that SM represented.
Is there a way in which the labor movement is just decimated by structural changes, or is there some political decimation as well?
It's both.
Yeah.
And I think the political and the legislative mechanisms that decimated the labor movement also reflected the new global realities of capitalism, in the sense that, of course, every administration wants the country to be competitive in attracting foreign investments. So you have to allow them the new export platforms, export processing zones where labor laws are basically suspended. And then you have to curtail any attempt at labor activism. If you allow trade unions at all, they must be company sponsored. sponsored trade unions. You must somehow restrict the declaration of too many strikes. So the emergence of a regime of arbitration, of flexibility in the law, in hiring systems, in order to reflect the new reality that sometimes you cannot hire, like malls, for example, there are months when you need so many sales personnel, but the rest of the year it's slim picking. You cannot expect them to. So it's to accommodate the form of capitalism that had taken root in our country, which is basically a consumer-oriented. I mean, this is a nation of consumers rather than producers. We're producing very little. What would be the base of your working class? The bulk of our exports are not cars, but semi-processed electronic products. They don't even produce the actual computers, but semiconductors that we get the semi-processed raw materials. We semi-process them, put some added value, and then ship them out again. You cannot breed an entire generation of working class with fully developed consciousness who become the mentors of a succeeding generation of working class under such a setup. It's very difficult.
So returning again to the political question, you write that at the end of the Ramos presidency, we now know that Philippine politics has come full circle. Traditional politics is fully restored. Can you explain?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that statement was written more in disgust than careful analytical rigor. Because I can't say full restoration of politics ante before martial law. No, political scene now is more diverse. I mean, you have businessmen running, like Villar running for president, movie actor running for president. That wasn't politics before martial law. Politics before martial law, you had political aristocrats who were bred expressly for politics. People who knew what legislation was like, who knew what debate was like. In other words, for better or for worse, we had a political class that had a lot of class. People like Recto, Tañada, Diokno, Aquino. Many of them were lawyers, actually. A few of them, there were very few from the landed class, although they represented the interests of the landed oligarchy, the traditional, like sugar interests, coconut interests, for example. But basically, these were professional politicians, probably the rough equivalent of your political class in the United States. It was inconceivable in the 1960s and early 70s for an Estrada to run for public office beyond mayor of a small town.
And that indicates there's something new happening, actually.
Something new was happening. Or inconceivable for a big businessman like Villar to himself run for president. Normally, you would support the candidacy of one bright, rising political star. But you don't put at risk your own business interests by you yourself becoming, and then your wife is senator, and then you run for president, you control it. It's something new here, and it's I don't quite know what it is, but it's more diverse. So it's not just a restoration of pre-martial law politics. I think I wrote that in basically, it was an exaggeration to say it was mainly to express basic disenchantment that we all felt when we supported, when we thought that the democratization project, which is where we started, with Mrs. Aquino, would really come to full fruition with the rise of new political parties, with the rise of non-party political formations having a say in the crafting of public policy, a more inclusive mass media so that the voices of the marginalized could be brought into the center of national debate. And even the concept of a party list organization lifted from the German experience, meant to represent the marginalized, underrepresented sectors, before it was bastardized, was reflective of a side of the early Cory Aquino years. In fact, maybe Dodong Nemenzo would remember this. The phrase, lakas ng sambayanan, the power of the people, was meant to be a movement in order to counter the influence of the old political elites. So a number of us were in the Cory government, which is both good and bad. My wife was Deputy Minister for Social Welfare and Development. I was appointed to be in charge of this think tank, to think of ways of crafting state policy with regard to the foreign debt, nuclear power, oil imports, currency exchange, and so on, which would have allowed us actually to tap the huge reservoir of intellect in academia. in order to bridge that gap. Because we in academia had always thought of government as an enemy. But now we thought of government as a project that we could work with and work in. We could sustain and also counterbalance the influence of the old elites, particularly of the anti-communist military, the anti-socialist military and police. Subsequently, we were out.
How quickly?
Very quickly. I would say my wife stayed for the longest, I think, 2 years under Cory. I gave up after 6 weeks because they wanted us to. I mean, the few briefing papers that I wrote for Ms. Aquino on the foreign debt, on how to handle the foreign debt, instead of owning up and paying up all the debts accumulated by Marcos, I was trying to induce the new government to explore new ways of negotiating that debt. Because after all, both the creditors and the debtors were equally responsible for incurring this debt and benefit the interest of the people. In other words, I think we were just concerned with riding on the global popularity of Cory and the promise of democratization in order to secure certain advantages for the country as a whole with the international creditor community. I thought it was the right time. I said, but that time will not last very long. It will not endure very long. We have to seize the moment. Now, we weren't listened to. They were listening to the businessmen who said that any talk of debt repudiation is anathema to the international financial community. And Cory understood that. Even those who were arguing for a more radical land reform program, we were forcing Cory to sign it now. Don't wait for Congress to be constituted because you are enjoying full legislative powers for more than 1 year under a freedom constitution. Basically, she had more powers than Marcos during that first year. But, she was not a comrade. She was not one of us. He belongs to one of the landed families, completely conservative in thinking. And the only influence would be through our Jesuit advisor, Father Bernas, and the other Jesuits, who were not like the Jesuits of the 1950s with social democratic aspirations. So she, and the whole situation, before I forget this, was not ripe for any radical experimentation as we thought it was. Why? Because the military that had been the partners of Cory at EDSA wanted a greater piece of the action of the political power, the administration of government, believing that they were equal partners at EDSA and therefore were entitled to equal power in the post-EDSA government. And when they could not get their way, they mounted 7 military coup attempts in succession. 2 of them nearly succeeded. And therefore, Cory had just to temper whatever radical noise was being made from within her cabinet. Before we knew it, even the most liberal voices were out of the government circuit.
Does this problem of the sack of potatoes still come back? There's not adequate political mediation and the horizon.
Of course. And the final analysis is that the constituency for change that you could have called upon, could have mobilized, was simply not there. In other words, I think Alexander Herzen was right. The revolutionary moment is here, but where are the forces? I came to the rendezvous, but where are you? So there is no substitute for organizing. We know that now. That was the whole idea behind BISIG before it ventured into electoral politics through Akbayan. Today, we have Akbayan, we have a senator in the Senate, we have 1 party list representative, but we could lose the next elections unless you have a constituency.
I guess BISIG was even trying to deal with the crisis in the military, the revolt. I assume
at some point.
There was something of a groundswell.
This was already long after Cory. This was during the time of Gloria Arroyo, after Ramos. We got to know the people who had been on the other side, the Young Officers Union, the Magdalo people. We were very young. We didn't realize that they had been reading our work and they had been longing for a conversation with us. The conversation finally happened. Dodong would tell you that. We were very close to some of them, actually. Trillanes, Danny Lim, Honasan, because we got to know them on a personal basis. We're not enemies, we're fighting for the same things, but you've got to shed off the excessive anti-communism and anti-socialism that was grounded into your brains by the military institution of which you were a part. At the same time, they were asking us to temper excessive radicalism that they saw in academia, among academics. It's a good experience, but it lacks the kind of the successive generation mentality that you would find, let us say, in a country like Indonesia. In Indonesia, every leader that that belongs to the same generation, in other words, born within the same 25-year period, regardless of whether you're in business or academia or in media or in the military or the police or in the arts, etc., it becomes incumbent upon you as Indonesians to come together at least once a year to review the situation of your country that you inherited from your elders and to make sure that the country that you're handing over to the next generation is in better shape than when you received it from your elders. There is that kind of, it's a different kind of nationalism actually that binds them together. I saw that. I thought that we might be able to emulate that success.
It's not, you still sort of have the anarchy of families thing.
It's not as difficult to bridge as I think some people think it is.
And I assume that also that's been undermined by capitalism actually since the 80s or before.
That is the least understood element, actually. That when we were in the third world studies, we were trying to figure that out. What are the dynamics of this new monopoly capitalism, the globalization of finance, financialization of the world economy? What does it mean for societies like us? The opening of the global labor market, which we've not talked about that, which unleashed a flurry of migrant workers. All 10 million of them, becoming the single most important pillar of the Philippine economy on which we're dependent in the last 42 years. It was meant to be a temporary provisional mechanism invented by OPLE in order to tide the country over during those years in the early 70s when the price of oil had quadrupled and we didn't have enough foreign exchange and the price of sugar in the world market had collapsed. What could we sell to the world? And OPLE said, our people. And it was the right time because the global labor market was loosening up. The Middle East countries, awash in petrodollars, needed to spend those dollars by building buildings. They didn't have workers. So Marcos said, we'll send you workers. We sent workers to Libya. We sent workers to Nigeria, teachers to Nigeria, workers to Saudi Arabia. Now you have 1.3 million Filipino workers in Saudi Arabia. We thought it was temporary. 42 years later, it's still there. We're still dependent on them. It's completely changed the configuration of the Philippine economy in ways totally unanticipated by any economic analyst. I would consider it the most important sociological phenomenon in the last 40 years. The opening up of the global labor market over which we had no control, but at the right moment we were able to seize it and build one kind of economy to take advantage of that internationalization of the labor market. And now we're totally dependent upon it. We can't get away from it. We're addicted to labor remittances from abroad.
Perhaps there could have been a political opportunity for organizing.
Oh, indeed, yes. We tried to in BISIG. But how could you enter Saudi Arabia and organize Filipino workers there? We could do it with the seamen in Europe, the shipping workers in Europe, working with European unions, social democratic unions. We have good relations with the Swedish Labour Party and the German Labour Party in those areas. But I think less and less attention was paid by BISIG subsequently to such essential organizing. We could have organized the workers in the business process outsourcing, BPO. Again, that's totally unanticipated. You have how many? About 1 million workers?
Several million now, I think.
In the BPO industry? Wow. No organizers, no unions there.
Any closing comments about this discussion?
No, what this has taught us, I think, is that there is no substitute for organizing. But we have to be aware that the working class changes as fast as there are changes in the world economy. There are many factors that are beyond our control, that are dictated by world events and world phenomena, which we must try to understand. And not the least of these are the changes in communication technology, which is giving rise to new types of industries and therefore new types of workers. But the essential need for organizing for political purposes remains, except that the methods must change, the vocabulary must change, the mentality of the types of leaders you need. There is a new type of media platform out there whose potentialities have not been fully explored, I think, by alternative thinkers that are concerned with the long-term survival of the working class. I think people are just so busy making both ends meet, surviving from day to day, that they cannot think of figuring out the new necessities that are upon us, the new requirements. For that, I think you need a new generation of organizers. Certainly, media has become far more complex now than ever. I was very happy for my short experience in media. I think it taught me a lot. It taught me the power of communication. taught me the power of media, of communicating ideas on screen, and media and consciousness, and what you could do if you were concerned with building a better social order. How do you deal with the potentials and the promises of media? That is a continuing challenge. Unfortunately, we cannot get past our old vocabularies of communication and stuck in the same models, same analog models in a digital world. No, there's a lot that must be done, but that's for the next generation. People like myself, we've had our time. We use the resources at our disposal when we had the chance to do that. We're happy for the experiences that we got. Some of these experiences were written out. Others, we left traces in the form of these programs. Although I don't have copies of them, I must have done more than 500 public affairs discussions on the same issues that we face today. It's almost like repeating them. But unlike writing columns, because then you can always turn to the archives of your newspaper, I cannot do so with Channel 13 and the other stations. I have no control and access to their archives. I wish some student, one of these days, some students would go over these programs over again, remaster them, digitalize them, and maybe put them on social media for a new generation to become familiar with the situations that we confronted not so long ago, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that we made, so that they profit from the rich experience that we created. Activists are not so good at documentation.
How about the party question of like embodying some sort of consciousness and the mediating role that it plays, right? Is that
the party?
If you were to have a party for the left that mediated the discontents and the experience of individuals, okay. Would that if that's missing, then can you do anything with media?
Oh, definitely. Then I think that you would have to reinvent the whole notion of a party.